We're here today with Karen Tibbals, author of a book titled Persuade, Don't Preach, Restoring Civility Across the Political Divide. Karen is a former corporate executive who left that career to go to seminary. While in school, she found moral foundation theory, which helped her understand the world in a new way. Since graduating with a degree in religion, she gives talks and writes books and newsletters about how to use the latest research to help overcome our differences. You can learn more about all of her work at persuadedon'tpreach.com. So Karen, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's really great to talk to you.
Well, I was really excited when I found out about your topic because it relates so directly to the How to Heal Our Divides work that I've been doing. And so I'm very interested in reading the book and also in, finding out more. I guess I should raise, this is the book itself.
Yay.
So everybody can find this, wherever books are sold, of course. But maybe before we start talking about the book directly, Karen, you can tell us more about your background.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I spent many years in corporate America. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry and marketing, and I really thought I understood why people did stuff. After all, I helped the companies I worked for sell their products, and I was pretty good at it. But I never understood politics or religion. And that was one of the questions that I brought with me when I had a calling and went to go to seminary. And I had other topics in mind, but that was one of them. And while I was working on my thesis for my degree in religion, I found moral foundation theory, which is a social psychology theory by Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham. And that just explained so much. And it really just changed the way I looked at both politics and religion. And I started talking to people about it. And then when I graduated with a degree in religion, okay, well, what do I do with it? Because I'm not going to lead a congregation. I have no idea what to do with it. But people were so interested in what I had to say about how to apply moral foundation theory, and they wanted to know more. So I wrote a book on it.
Good for you. Now, in addition to this book, you also have written other things, and you've got, I mentioned the website. Tell us more about, the other things besides the book that you're involved in.
Right. So when I was promoting the book and giving talks to churches and organizations, I speak in community organizations and churches and libraries and places like that. And I gave a talk to a university in Indiana, a conservative Christian university, who wanted me to come talk. I think it helped their students understand what their elders were saying, because they had very different perspectives. Anyway, as I was giving these talks, I started learning from my audiences, and I love to learn from my audiences. And one of them turned me on to an idea from another Quaker by the name of Bonnie Tinker, who was a gay rights activist who was killed a few years ago. But she was giving workshops on other ways to talk to people in productive ways. So I started exploring her, and I decided to do a newsletter on her technique. And then I found other ones. And so I'm writing a newsletter every week on techniques that I find. I scour all sorts of materials from all sorts of places. I got material from cult experts, from what is it? from negotiators and like for terrorists and all sorts of places, litigators. I'll take it from anywhere. I'm looking for the gems for how people can talk to each other in a more productive way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Very cool. So let's get into the details around the book. As I mentioned, the title of it is Persuade, Don't Preach, Restoring Civility Across the Political Divide. So you talked a little bit about, how that came about, but can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. So as I said, moral foundation theory really rocked the way I looked at the world. And I understood things I didn't understand anymore. And what I learned was that what's important is what's invisible. What's invisible to us is our values. We just take them for granted. We just assume that everybody else has the same values that we do. But in one sense they do, in another sense they don't. And for a religious audience, I can say, I don't say this to non-religious audience, I can say, God made us with these certain values. And Haidt has identified 5 of them. which are respect for authority, a desire to belong, a sacredness, care for others, and fairness. Now, we all have those basic five, and this is across cultures, across all over the world. They've done this research. But what they found is we place different importance on the different values. And we only pay attention to the ones that we place the importance on. And we ignore the other ones. And what's happening is that we don't see the other ones as relevant and as valuable and as real. We denigrate them. But it's my belief that if we come to a realization that these are all important values, that these are, again, this is the way God made us, and that there's a reason for the differences, but that we learn to appreciate them. And then once we learn to appreciate them, if we can learn to use them to talk to each other, we can come to agreement much better.
So clearly, our country is incredibly polarized, divided, and there's probably all kinds of different forms that it takes. What do you think is the underlying cause for that?
Well, social scientists have identified two causes, one of which is what's called social sorting, where we only associate with people who are like us. We've done that physically. We've done that in how we marry, in how we create our friend groups. And then the other major cause is social media, because that again allows us to sort and only associate with those that we already like. So that doesn't give us an opportunity to associate with people we don't like, and then that sets up more of a divide. It just makes things worse. So one of the techniques that I recommend in my newsletter is to just spend time with people you don't like. But to do it in such a way that you're going to find a common ground. And anthropologist Joseph Henrich and Anne Applebaum, who's a political journalist, both recommend finding a way to do a project with people that you don't like. So you complete something together. And this is the kind of tips that I put in my newsletter.
Okay. That was specifically the recommendation of one of the chapters in the first How to Heal Our Divides book, where it talked about doing mission projects together between churches that maybe have constituents that are quite different from each other. That was, basically a similar, kind of approach to what you're describing. Now, there's several organizations that have been featured in the How to Heal Our Divides books that basically run forums, for lack of a better term, where they bring together people from, different sides of a particular issue. There's Braver Angels, Three Practices, Colossian Forum, Crossing Party Lines. Are you familiar with any of those organizations or others?
I know Braver Angels. I actually, on my website, I've got a list of links to various organizations. I don't have all of the ones that you mentioned, but I'll have to add them now. Another one that I've run across is What is Essential, which is out of Boston, which does a lot of work in churches.
Okay. So how do you think that these groups are doing what your book suggests?
No, they really aren't.
Interesting.
It's a technique that can be added into any of these.
Okay.
They have their own format. They have their own recommendation of what to do. And, they all do great work. They all do great work. And they're all, we need all these different approaches, because no one way is going to be the solution. But this is just something you can add in, and it's subtle. It's so subtle. I mean, it doesn't have to be a big deal. For instance, I was on my walk in the morning, and I ran into a group of people, and I met somebody I didn't know, and we got on the topic of gay marriage, and she said, the Pope says no to gay marriage. And she said, I don't understand why they can't do just a civil union. And I said, but what if they think marriage is a sacred value that is important to them? Now, sacredness is one of the moral foundations. So it wasn't anything major that I said. And she just couldn't think of anything to say to me. Now, I don't know if it changed her mind, but it was just a subtle little change that I could do that maybe had an impact. I don't know if it did, but it didn't offend her. It didn't, we didn't get into a fight over it, but it was just a little something I could do.
So, what's most surprising to you in terms of what you find out about our differences?
Well, what I think that was surprising to me, and I think other people will find it surprising, is how our coalition for Democrats is how fragile it is, because there's a huge disconnect in values between the progressives and people of color who are in the Democratic coalition. People of color tend to be much more conservative in their values. And that's why you see some Hispanics going to the Republican Party, because they match their values. So I think that's one thing that if we learn how to talk to each other about our values and surface them, make them real, and respect them and honor the values that other people have, I think we could strengthen that coalition.
So you said that you've, spoken with a lot of folks, churches and other audiences. What kinds of resistance have you found from people, and what has been your response to that?
Yeah, well, generally, people who ask me to talk generally are positive, but there are some people who are listening who are not. And some people say, well, why do I have to change? They're the ones with the problem. And, my answer to that is, well, the only people we can change are ourselves. Another answer that I gave in a sermon that I give occasionally is to talk about the differences between Jonah, the prophet in the Old Testament, and how he was called to preach the people of Nineveh, which was Israel's enemy. And it took him a lot to get there, but he finally obeyed God and went there. But he still regarded them as the enemy. And after he finished preaching, he sat outside waiting to watch the fireworks for them being destroyed. And when they weren't, he cried a bitter tear. And God rebuked him. And I think Jonah is so relevant to us today for how we regard our enemies. But Jesus, who's teaching a lot from the Old Testament, is asking us to go beyond that and to love our enemies. And that requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of work. So that's another answer that I give. People say why we should do it. Another major resistance I get is from a lot of white men who think that what they're doing is working. Because they have they have the power, and they, without maybe recognizing it, they think that they know they're getting somewhere. Versus women who know that they have to find other ways to get there. And then I think the third major resistance is people think there's no use. It's a system. I can't do anything.
Well, it does seem like this huge intractable problem, right? I mean, that, how can any one of us influence? But that's what it ends up having to be, I think, is a grassroots thing where, everybody tries to listen and cooperate.
Exactly. It takes everybody making a little bit of change. And we don't have to make major changes. Like I said in my conversation with my neighbor, just little tiny things, these little tricks. And that's what I'm trying to focus on in the newsletter. That's what the book is about. I've got a workbook for the book to help people walk through how to apply the ideas in their lives and see it. Because like I said, these values are invisible. And what I'm trying to do is raise people's awareness of them so they can become conversant in them. And I've been working on this for a few years, and it takes a while. It takes a while.
So I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for your book. Richard Rohr says, this book is a helpful guide to how to understand people in such a way that you can talk to them more productively. So this sounds like a very practical book. Would you say that's the case?
Yes, that's exactly what I like to do is I like to take the academic and the theoretical and make it very practical. As a matter of fact, I asked both the authors of the work that I'm using whether or not they would write the book with me, and they said, no, you write it, because they're not practical like me.
Cool. And so here's another quote from our friend Brent Bill. He says, "Persuade, don't preach" is an important resource for those who would like to see more civil discourse around hard issues in our polarized society. Um, Brent's an author friend of ours, and he's a Quaker, as you are. What do you feel like the rest of us can learn from Quakers about healing divides specifically?
I think we have to look within ourselves. Now, I'll talk in Quaker theology. There's that of God within each of us, and there's that of God within our opponent, within our enemy, and seeing that. That's really another way of saying what I'm trying to say is, we all have little pieces of God, and seeing that the other person has that and honoring that.
So where do you see taking this work from here? Do you have like any future books that you're planning or other projects beyond what you're doing right now?
Well, I'm working on turning the newsletter into a book.
Okay.
That's in process. I'm also working on turning my thesis into a book. I had studied early Quaker business people and what was the religious basis for their success, because they were very successful. So that's also that's a little bit later stage, but working on that too.
Cool. So for the first book, Persuade, Don't Preach, did you self-publish that?
Yes, I did.
And how did you find that experience work for you?
Well, it was actually my second book. My first book, I did a similar book, but for marketing, because that's my background.
Okay.
So I had some experience.
Okay.
So that was it was a huge learning curve. But I think it worked. I think it worked really well. And I get my books stocked in a couple of bookstores, but it's on all online bookstores, because everybody stock once you publish through Ingram, everybody stocks book, but not physical bookstores.
Yeah, right. So I teach classes, to people who are just getting started. And part of what we talk about is the different publishing options, and I tell them that independent publishing has never been more attractive than what it is today. Not that it's the right fit for everybody, and I'm not trying to convince anybody of it, but it's certainly a very viable option.
Definitely. I heard one of the speakers at Wild Goose talk about how they were writing something out of their genre and they can't get it published. Well, that's through a traditional publisher. And I wanted to say to him, consider self-publishing it. If you really want to get it out, you should self-publish, because it's not very hard. There is a learning curve, and you have to do your own marketing. But if you're not a major author, you got to do your own marketing anyway.
Exactly. So again, the title is Persuade, Don't Preach, Restoring Civility Across the Political Divide, and you can learn more about it at persuadedon'tpreach.com. So Karen, thanks again for joining us and for all your work on this topic. I think it's very, very important.
Thank you, Brian. I'd appreciate anybody in the audience who would love to contact me or read my newsletter at Mending Fractured Relationships.
Great. Thank you, Karen.